Welcome back to the Security Ledger podcast. I'm your host, Paul Roberts. I'm the editor-in-chief here at the Security Ledger, and I'm very happy to have Jim Broome with us in the studio, who is the Chief Technology Officer at DirectDefense. Jim, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. I think this is the first time we've had you on the show, but kind of surprising because
long-time listener, first-time caller.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. Man, you got an amazing career, and you've been in cyber going back to the late 90s. So one of the questions I always start by asking my guests, particularly guests of our vintage, is what was your journey into InfoSec, right? Because some of these stories are really interesting.
Yeah, actually, I go back to the days of bulletin boards. At one point, I had one of the larger bulletin boards in the state of Georgia and grew up around that crowd. And as kind of alluded to, you used to be at a company called Internet Security Systems. I think you've actually had a few former alums like Caleb a couple of years ago on your show. And we all kind of gravitated around knowing each other, former Georgia Tech alum. But yeah, for me, it was starting from bulletin boards, early days of before AOL and CompuServe were really a thing. Truth be told, actually, CompuServe bought my little board because I had the largest amount of dial-up in the area. And then they turned that into a pot for their service and moved on. So that was when I was a sophomore in high school. So, and kind of grew from there, just always was inquisitive about security. And at the time, it was Novell was the new hotness coming off of Lantastic. So yeah, the gray hair is real when I start throwing out references like that. But really just kind of growing and learning, security, being an admin, being a network administrator. Like one of my first companies was actually just supporting customers and rolling out networks for one of my first major customers was like Barnett Bank. So actually, when they were putting teller or remote banks everywhere, they were having my crew come in and actually like do all the wiring and do all the infrastructure. So I learned a lot of things about just basic user behavior and user mistakes that, turned into a security career. So.
Now, were your parents like engineers or in tech, or did you just get into it just because like you got a home?
Very much so. Yeah, my father was definitely in tech. To make myself a complete and total nerd, owned several franchise Radio Shack stores through the Caribbean and in Georgia and Florida where he lived at. So if you ever want to talk about having to work Christmas at a Radio Shack store and having the questions about customer support,
in the
this
80s.
Doesn't work. Did you? I don't want to insult you, but did you turn it on? It has an on switch. Yeah, it turns it on, just runs fine. So kind of went through all the things you can think of what builds a good security person, which is understanding the mistakes people are going to make along the way and kind of growing from there. And so, my career path was fortunate. I wound up moving up into Michigan, meeting a company that became known as Netrex. And we were literally my first week, we became the first reseller Checkpoint Firewall 1 in North America before they even shipped 1.0. And so we got to ride that wave. And myself and the co-founder of that company, Mark Sims, we had a chance to go over to Israel, meet the founding four. And, ultimately it turned into myself and he and actually my wife were the primary authors of the Checkpoint training program. So traveled the world preaching the gospel and met this cool little guy named Christa Ray Klaus and wound up a couple months later at the Internet Security Systems and got full-time into penetration testing from there. So call back to Caleb's episode of like early days was people wanted validation of why they needed this product, and firewalls were not a thing. They actually did not become standard commonplace until like 2001. So the 90s was very ripe for compromise and access.
Yeah, I remember Caleb sort of talking about the whole SQL injection thing and basically him being like, this is just every website I look at has one of these things.
Yeah. No, it was definitely fish in the barrel. Greenfields. People using internet routable IP addresses on every desktop, and even fast forwarding from ISS going to Accuvant. And about that time, we were able to actually really build some large teams for ourselves, and really by that point we started getting speciality in the industry. So I like to tease that I was in this before it was considered an industry. Now I'm in an industry, and with that comes speciality. So now we have the true delineation between network penetration testing, application penetration testing, security research, mobile device only, embedded platforms, OT security. So I kind of just on the offensive side of the house, the landscape has definitely changed across the board.
Change is the constant, right? And I've been doing this for 20 years, and it's just first of all, bad guys keep innovating, right? So that keeps all of us trying to keep up. But you're right. I think the clear trend over the decades is just diversification of technologies, solutions, problems, and I think
we solved
we,
a couple along the way, but we caused
yeah,
more. Yeah. So yeah, I
there's a
mean,
game that they
yeah,
call, what is it?
whack-a-mole. Yes. We literally were just talking about this the other day. Phil Brass runs our consulting side of the house, and he's also a former ISS alum. His name is actually
Yeah.
on the patent for Internet Scanner. And
Wow.
yeah, we were teasing. It's like back in the 90s, like if you were to tell me I was supposed to go hack someone's web browser, I would have laughed at you. We only looked
Yeah.
for operating system and core service vulnerabilities. And now it
Yeah.
became, now desktops. Desktop applications that have permeated servers and workstations and mobile devices are the primary entry point when we talk about vulnerability exploitation today.
Sure.
There's still plenty of other problems, but that's kind of the main things we're seeing commonly, like infected Office documents or PDFs, or click this because it'll execute this other program that you didn't know about inside of Windows that offers that implant through the threat actor. And so to your point, it's a game of whack-a-mole that now you kind of have to broaden your experience on every aspect. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, DirectDefense, obviously MSSP, and still doing, in many ways, a lot of the same types of engagements and work. How have you seen kind of the conversation change when you look at the work that, DirectDefense does with its customers?
I mean, it's in most cases actually supporting customers. We have the benefit of engaging from, if you will, the mid-market, that 1,000 to 10,000 employee organization that is just getting their hands on it, to maybe they're supporting, the military, DoD supply chain. So now CMMC, yet another standard, has come into play for them. So they're trying to mature quickly. And so, our testing is from the programmatic. We're actually doing the validation testing with a penetration test to see if the solutions they've implemented work. We're doing programmatic testing at scale for applications as they go to market with a product, or, doing their own certification of their own utility, their own procedures along the way. All the way up to manufacturing is actually a big customer base for us. That the CISO, the ever-changing job of the responsibility of the CISO is, post-pandemic, the demand for certain brands is so high that if they can't put the widget into the box on the assembly line fast enough, or they have a 15-minute unscheduled outage, the CEO gets a phone call to let them know they're not making their numbers. That's the tolerance level. And so the testing services, the managed services that come along with that.
I just stepped out to grab a bite. What did I miss?
Truth be told, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. We've got some great partnerships with vendors like Clarity that give us that OT visibility.
Cyber company,
yeah. But it gives us, not only a cyber capability in the traditional sense of network visibility, but really the biggest requests for our managed services are around change management. Just the unauthorized, updates at 3 o'clock in the morning because Bob happened to be able to come through during shift change and plug a USB key and update the firmware for whatever this thing that controls the gate, and now the line's down. Having that level of visibility is now turning into a real value add story, for ourselves and for our customers. But yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to see where cyber and just reality come into play. A lot of times that will impact, the overall bottom line for a company.
So DirectDefense has put together its threat report for 2023, 2024.
Yep, hence my grades are a little lighter now, but yeah.
Which by the time this comes out, it will be out, but I've looked at a draft of it. First of all, I always really love the threat reports that come from MSSPs, because they actually, as opposed to just sort of vendors, which have a very kind of blinkered look at the world through their technology. MSSPs, like, you are actually in the trenches with companies, right? So
I appreciate that. Yeah.
you're seeing everything,
Yeah.
and but I always find those have a little bit more substance and credibility maybe than others. But some really interesting trends that you all are calling attention to in that report, and it's we'll put a link on it. It's definitely worth downloading. One of them I thought was really interesting was, just, which we've read about, and I mean, it's not surprising, is just attacks on two-factor authentication, multifactor authentication, as being something that you all are seeing frequently as part of offensive operations on customers. Yeah. Talk about that, because we all thought that multi-factor authentication was the silver bullet that was going to keep us from getting hacked. What gives?
I mean, so long story short was, it's again, let's go back to things that need to mature. My current example, I kind of like going back to time and time again, is over the years, Microsoft has done a really good job of actually securing their operating system. The question or the challenge for most customers is, when can you go native? When can you run the most effective, most efficient, version of a Microsoft network? Vulnerabilities I used to exploit in my younger days in the career have been resolved as of Windows 2008. However, they linger because people don't go back and run DC promo and
Yeah.
turn off the backward compatibility mode. So,
Yep.
by the way, if you don't know, if you still have backward or mixed mode turned on your on domain, you're still supporting settings from Windows for Workgroups in the 80s. Just throwing it out there. And that kind of directly transitions to the threat landscape for MFA is, yes, it is a much needed thing because username and passwords are too easy to predict or guess. We crack passwords for fun. We guess passwords to show off your amazing Kreskin skills on how you can predict someone's really terrible password they may use. And MFA was the option of last resort. If the threat actor gets username and password, they still got to get something that's in your hands. And the problem we've found is, number one, as we alluded to with AI enablement, the things they were taught to look for and protect the organization against from a user level have kind of been eradicated. And user awareness training needs to get updated for that side of the house. But number two was users still give away those three things. If they fall for a decent looking fish, they're going to give away username, password, and then mistakenly accept that prompt. The biggest area that made all the news, as everybody saw, which was scattered spider,
Yeah.
specifically the technique that they kind of, I won't say pioneer, but refined, was attacking organizations that still support text messaging. We've
Mm-hmm.
long since said text messaging should never be a factor for multi-factor. Matter of
Yeah.
fact, their banks should have stopped using it years ago, but they're federally insured. We can get to a bigger conversation on that. But it's just leveraging a technology, aka your cell phone carrier, which is outside of the control of the employee and the employer.
Yep.
So now we have a threat vector that literally for the nominal fee of $1,500 to $2,500 was being exploited to bypass your hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of cybersecurity investment,
Mm-hmm.
just because they were able to go into a store, pretend to be your employee,
Mm-hmm.
trick the cell phone carrier into porting that phone number to a device they controlled, and then using text message to log in.
Right. This was the subject of a 60 Minutes segment. Allison Nixon was in it a couple weeks back, or maybe it was even last week. And I mean, we've kind of seen this and read about this, maybe in the context of like crypto wallet heists and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that, right? I think
Yep.
maybe what surprised people about that was just this notion that actually, no, this is nation state actor with boots on the ground here, able to
Mm-hmm.
walk into a cell phone provider and do a SIM swapping attack. That for me was like, wow,
Now it's loaded kids, and we've even gone as far as seeing videos online of
Yeah.
kids working together, literally going to a team,
Yep.
it's branded as a T-Mobile store, and waiting till the manager hands in their tablet for them to give in their creds, and they just run out the door.
Right.
So if you think about the control procedures to how do you revoke a tablet access, calling corporate, an 800 number back to T-Mobile corporate saying, hey,
Yeah.
XYZ store just lost a device that was logged in with admin creds. And then the news that made it this week, I believe, was the article about how, literally T-Mobile employees were being phished directly, being text messaging by threat actors offering $300 for them to do a SIM swap.
Right.
So, yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're down. We're here at local retail outlets, people being paid an
Mm-hmm.
hourly wage, right? I mean,
Yep.
so in most Fortune 500 companies might not say, well, this is the foundation that our
Yes.
security infrastructure
Yes.
is built on, but
Yep.
it kind of
Exactly. It
is,
is. Yeah, it
just
is. Yeah.
because of the consumerization of IT, because these smartphones that we all own personally are actually critical business implements that we use to access a lot of really high value systems. Yeah, I mean, it's like
Yeah.
just wrapping your head around that. Oh my
Well,
gosh.
even like the byproduct of just seeing this was working back with our customers on the managed service side and going back and adding custom rule sets that, number one, if you can't eradicate the use of text messaging, at least for admin users, then let's come up with a comparable, like, your standard is the notification push or a pin.
Yep.
If I see the user's MFA settings get downgraded to text messaging, should I go ahead and lock that account out?
That's right.
Those type of things were the byproduct of, hey, this is what they're doing, Mr. Customer, are you prepared for this problem? Yes or no?
That's right.
Yeah.
You really have to think outside of the normal box of IT, right? You need to have a pretty capacious view of like where the threats are going to come from and what types of systems and behaviors you need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Speaking of which, so in your Direct Defense's new threat report, you talk, as you must, about the emergence of generative AI, ChatGPT, and
Yep.
how it's been a real game changer for cyber adversaries, for attackers. Definitely helping with things like phishing attacks, right?
Yep.
Kind of cleaning up language. What are some of the other ways that you're seeing AI being used to kind of raise the bar for defenders?
The challenge really is understanding, like, if you go to your traditional user awareness training on phishing, how to spot a phish, it's the hover over the name, look for spelling mistakes, look for non-geographical specific phrasing, all the way up to nothing specific to your company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
95% of that's gone now.
Right.
So it
Right.
looks right, smells right, looks like somebody from my company wrote it. It's probably got one of our own internal acronyms because someone mistakenly typed that and the source code went out there in ChatGPT, which is another problem. But we've got everything that looks like a legitimate email. And so we all collectively on the MSSP side of the world, MDR side of the world, saw a spike really around Q3 of last year where it kind of went off the charts, where you're getting a handful on a weekly basis of successful lands to 15, 25% there for a while of successful lands inside the environment. The employee clicked, and we saw signs of access from an outside party into the organization. And so that became to your earlier example, that became a great game of whack-a-mole of just seeing how everything we've taught our users to look for, just that problem's been gone. Now you've got to go back and retrain for, does it look right? Is it the right time for this? Why is someone asking me about a project that's internal to the company? And really just kind of being aware. I mean, and then secondarily is the one I kind of have the most fun with. If you think about an organization, security guys, I constantly say, don't click it, don't link it, don't open it up if you don't know who it came from. However, what's the two members or two organizations in most companies that are required to do that? Accounts payable
Mm-hmm.
and HR. They're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to look at resumes. They're supposed to look at bank change requests. So now you've got a class of employee that has a lot of access in the organization, if not has some keys to the kingdom, especially around money, that is required to do everything you just told everybody else not to do. And so if you haven't built your parameters and your visibility around helping them, especially, you're going to come up short. You're going to fall victim. And that's where you still see today the ACH transfer campaign from business email compromises and so forth still being successful.
You said that some huge percentage of the compromises the DirectDefense has helped companies with were forms of business email compromise, BEC types attacks. Is that just reflective of like, well, all of these kind of start with phishing via email and that type of thing? Or is it, when I think business email compromise, I also often think of the sort of like, oh, I'm the CFO and I'm telling you to wire money to this account, or and is AI playing a role in making those harder to pick out too?
The initial compromise of company A, company B, like the most common thing we've seen, there are still direct attacks from random threat actor on the internet just drive by and they've got 770 million email addresses they scraped out of LinkedIn 2 years ago using that as their platform. But we've really seen the most success rate of compromise happening with customers and early detection from our part is really A to B, business to business, interaction activity. Maybe it's a business partner, maybe it's part of your supply chain. One of the two of the organizations got compromised, and in most cases, it was hours before. And you could easily start walking back, and you just like, oh well, I've like the most common phishing campaign I saw last year was a fake notice from Microsoft, and I'm putting air quotes on that for M365, telling the employee, would you like to reuse the same password you did last month, and then please type it in. And so that was enough. Maybe they had MFA, maybe they didn't. Either way, one of the parties got compromised, and the threat actor would then insert
playing
themselves
on that
into
deep
the
desire to not reset your password. Like,
exactly. Yeah. And then they would implant themselves into a mailbox, walk through the mail, the correspondence between the two parties talking about wire transfers, and then insert themselves, literally picking up the legitimate correspondence you had, and then pivoting out to a third-party domain or rewriting a couple of mailbox rules to sit inside of that the compromised employee's account and hijack that conversation. So AI may have spent the first part to get the implant, but then it's just good old human. Like, did you notice that the domain changed 8 emails ago? The answer is no, and that's why I'm here as an incident responder at the moment.
Right.
And so it's very hard. I can't fault the employee in some cases, in most cases in that scenario, because the only thing that changed was the email address you're talking to. Like, one of the parties got legitimately compromised, and then you get the finger pointing, and then all the insurance guys come in to try to figure out who was at fault.
Right.
But getting that visibility, having a third party like, DirectDefense in our case, monitoring where your employees are logging in from, having that ability to actually see where they're most commonly logging in from and spotting the anomaly is your first signs of true compromise inside the organization, and then, remediation of that. Microsoft has done a really good job, to their credit, of putting new stuff into Defender for Cloud. Some of that stuff are rules that we've been doing for 5+ years. So, had a leg up for now, and now we're adding more nuance to what they're doing. And so that's all kind of part of the cat and mouse game of, spot when the compromise happen and go from there.
Do you see AI kind of, because I mean, AI benefits attackers, but also
Yes.
defenders? And how is direct defense? Where do you see the applications of it from the MSSP? One way that you clearly pointed out is just kind of sifting through all that noise and helping your operators and folks focus on, those subtle changes that might be
Mhm.
very important to notice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from a detection standpoint, we've definitely seen a rise in, leveraging AI into assisting in actually detecting initial signs of compromise or initial, strings or tethers being pulled on that in that scenario. You've also seen new vendors come to market addressing legacy problems in a new way, and I'll give a shout out to like Abnormal Security as an example, where they've done an excellent job of taking the old school spam problem, but actually really giving it a higher confidence around detection of real compromise. And, like one of the things we lost with all the awareness training is there's no such thing as junk mail anymore. It's all spam, it's all evil. And what we find is to actually know Bob or Sally are kind of a little lazy. They don't use the junk mail option in Outlook. We haven't taught our employees how to filter their mail correctly. So everything's spam and it gets thrown to the SOC for analysis. And so, they've come up with a really good detection pattern, in my opinion, on spotting these AI generated campaigns. They actually call it out as this was AI. This was not written by a human. And, been able to give us a high degree of detection in the early phases of that one vector. Then we pivot into the defender side of the house where, EDRs are all, AI, ML, EIO enabled on the back end to give us a fighting chance. And then from the detection realm, yeah, again, there's more AI modeling being applied today inside of just detection, especially around legacy problems such as configuration errors, Kerberoasting is the most common example of that. Of as good as Microsoft's gotten, we still got some stuff that's been around for about 15 years that hasn't been eradicated out of their platform yet. And Kerberoasting is number one. And the only way to effectively detect that is having a subject matter solution or a near real-time solution like Defender for Identity or Falcon for Identity to give us, the defenders, a leg up on seeing when it's being actively compromised, because it's your network generates this stuff legitimately every day. How do I spot, the red pin, the red top needle out of a stack of needles? Because that was the one that actually was the attack. And so having those, AI platforms assist us is also a major, contributing for detection.
I mean, obviously, one of the big trends the last 15 years is just digital transformation, right? Just the migration of so many applications, so much of our infrastructure to the cloud. Hugely empowering for organizations from a productivity standpoint, but it does create problems around transparency, right? And visibility into cyber risk. One of those being, as you point out in your report, there really are no standards for application security or secure development that companies can point to or make decisions based on. How do you work with your customers to kind of assess that cloud risk or kind of manage that, given that a lot of these systems are kind of black boxes?
Yeah, I mean,
At least for now.
yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of a multi-part answer for you. I mean, the first part is testing at scale. I mean, that's one of the core businesses here. And, this industry has been wrapped around having testing like OWASP. OWASP is one of the most common standards we use for actually just testing for most common coding mistakes or implementation mistakes. So that framework exists. What we've found, especially with incident response, and then more importantly, application environment DevOps shops trying to use an MSSP, is the lack of visibility in the app. And so when you think about just good old fashioned audit 101, that doesn't exist in a lot of application code base today. I'll be candid. In probably the last 10 years, I can only count on one hand the number of times I saw an app properly have audit frameworks inside of it. So if you think about,
And is that just the agile development and the nature of and cloud and just
they're just
these
not taught.
applications? Yeah.
They're not taught. So I mean,
Okay.
if you think about, how do you spot credential stuffing? Someone successfully breaking in with a list of username and passwords into your app. And in most cases, the answer is they can't. They have to wait till some other, like a performance problem happens because they're getting slammed with all these millions of requests. Now that people figured out you have this problem, how do you detect fraud in your application based on what, whatever technique your application is leveraging and how it's using? And the answer is we waited for the API to tell us it was oversaturated. There is no audit to tell me. And we actually have some professional services that we do just to sockify your application and make sure it's prepared to, can you detect compromise of a user? What's it take to have a user account today? Username, password, maybe a phone number for 2FA. Again, text messaging, we'll get into that. How do you transfer money out of this application? Maybe it's a wire transfer, maybe it's, a direct coupon system. All these things come into play that there should be an audit artifact. If you just can't read the log and read it as a human and say, oh, bad thing happened here, your SOC is not going to be able to stop and protect your app and the users of your app. So that's kind of really where we're spending a lot of time, is kind of re-educating the development cycle. And thankfully, a lot of the customers are receptive to it. The organization is willing to go back and put that into their development backlog and get it built into the app. But, again, in the fast-paced world of high finance .coms out there, data reference, mobile, newer platforms, that may not necessarily be the case. They may prioritize just functionality and go to market over, auditability and accountability.
You got a little bit of a wind at your back, I feel like, from the current administration and the federal government. They're certainly talking a lot, at least for federal contractors, about these topics of, secure by design. We want to see SBOMs. We want to, you need to show us that you're, doing the right thing when we, lift up the hood. But of course, that's just for federal contractors, right? And in fact, a lot of that hasn't really taken hold yet.
It doesn't have teeth yet. So
does it have teeth? That's actually, right.
Yeah. Until you see, just like HIPAA, until you see the first rule lawsuits, it's a nice to have. It's a recommendation.
Yeah. For medical devices, there are teeth, but for everything else, not so much.
Yeah. I mean, I spent a large swath of my career there for when HIPAA became a thing, just helping hospital organizations fight back and push back to, the owners of the MRI, the owners of the, the Alaris pump system or what have you, on the IV, just to like, hey, your solution actually spits, MR code, patient data out to the parking lot because it's using this antiquated, pre 802.11 technology.
Right. So, well, I mean, look at the Avanti, what we've seen come from Avanti, right? I mean, just a whole bunch of stuff this week, a whole slew of new vulnerabilities. My guess is, I don't know, I'm inferring this, but they're starting to look a little bit more closely at their code and finding a lot of stuff. So,
well, I mean,
better late than never, but.
Well, even like sort of my analogy at the beginning there with the, the migration of server and operating systems, the biggest thing we've seen in the last 2 years post-pandemic is direct compromise of security platforms.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been, just for their, I'll give the credit, but for the four guys at Fortinet, Fortinet, Palo Alto, Cisco, all their SSL VPNs have gotten a good whacking for the past, few years. And I've actually had IR, ransomware investigations. That was the point of entry.
Right. Okay, 2 more questions. Got time?
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the big challenges, and MSSPs, are important players in this, is kind of what now they're called the security poverty line, right? Like just the ability of small firms, SMBs, and less wealthy firms to afford, high level cybersecurity, both the people, the systems, right? How do you see that playing out right now? And, kind of what's your advice to some of those SMBs and small enterprises out there who, are concerned about the risk, but don't have the deep pockets of, the financial services firms or even the venture funded tech firms, to go out and buy what they need?
Multi-answer here as well. Number one is make sure you're getting what you expect. The whole concept of MDR, especially those empowered by vendors, is essentially the interpretation of how they expected their product to be used. What kind of gets lost along the way is the customer experience. Mr. and Mrs. Customer, what did you hope to get out of this? What was your goal besides just having someone look over your shoulder at 3:00 in the morning to make sure it got detected? So like part of my education that I do for my own customers, first time they talk to us about our managed services is like, right now, ask everybody you're talking to, hold me accountable to it as well. Will you support a custom alert? Will you support a custom triage playbook? And will you support a custom response? And you'll find that if you put 10 MDR providers in the same room right now, you're going to only wind up with 2 to 3 that actually can answer yes to all 3. And there's a reason why, and that's go-to-market strategy. It's hard to scale that amount of customization on our side. But again, make sure you're getting what you're paying for, and then realize the visibility you are getting. There's a lot of endpoint empowered platforms today that are still out there advertising as a core component. And yeah, malware is a major problem of our industry, but it's not everything. And so make sure you're getting malware covered, you're getting authentication covered, and you're getting your cloud visibility and covered as well.
Right.
And so that's kind of the big things I tell customers, like just make sure you're getting what you're looking for, and then we can talk about price after the fact and get.
There's a lot of variety under that umbrella of
Right.
MSSP, right? Under the
Right.
category, right? A lot of variation, a lot of different types of configurations. Okay, final question. You wrote a really interesting piece on dark reading a few weeks back, which we'll link to, talking about it's been just a persistent problem in our industry, which is filling jobs and finding new people to take on, important InfoSec roles, whether it's SOC operator or what have you. And you were basically sort of arguing we need to open our minds about what types of people might really work in these roles. Talk about kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, our entire industry came from academia. And so we do believe in higher education, having a master's degree, but I've never met a master's degree person that was really good at managing firewalls on a day-to-day basis. There may be a few of them out there, but at the end of the day, it's really a true focused, apprenticeship program. And so if you ever see me talk and get out there, I've been saying cyber is the new blue collar for almost a decade. It needs to be treated as such, and we need to be open to people that came into this industry from non-traditional sources.
Yeah.
My past lineage, and I'll even shout him out here, it was like, gentlemen like Martin Boss, who's one of the key members over there at Trusted Sec with Dave Kennedy and the guys. Martin is kind of the one I was talking about in the article specifically, where he came from being essentially a sound engineer for some very prominent bands, but he was there during that transformation of analog to digital. So he got the experience of core network foundations and understanding, the pressure of putting on a live performance in front of 15,000 people and not screwing up.
Right.
So,
high stakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you really want to make somebody mad, watch Taylor Swift not be able to give her concert, because the mic's not working.
This just happened to Grimes at Coachella, pressure. By the way. I don't know if you read that article.
I saw. Yeah.
It was pretty ugly.
Yeah, but and again, it's look for people that's coming from non-traditional sources. I really enjoyed the comments from the article because while I noted we definitely need to find more diversity in the industry itself and bringing people in, especially those that are not really STEM oriented, but really have a good core acumen for being an analyst or being a compliance person or being just a really good project manager is really looking at non-standard areas. So one of the things I'll actually one of the comments is like one of the people that she would recommend was people that are event planners. Event planners, especially, if you think about, there's TV shows called Broadzilla for a reason of, being able to think on your feet, having a very hostile environment and still being able to get a creative output done, bringing in those
attention
type
to detail,
careers. Yeah. Exactly. And then most recently, as before we got on recording, I shared, I've been doing some seminars here locally in Colorado where I live at. And I work with a couple of the STEM programs with like Cyber Patriots and so forth as well. And it got brought to my attention, there is a cultural shift of people in their 20s and 30s. They're postgraduate, they're into their career, and it maybe didn't pan out for them. May not be the career they really wanted, or is not the environment they want to continue working in. And so one of those non-standard areas I've been seeing the largest inquiry literally in the last 2 months has actually been nursing. So,
really interesting.
As you alluded to and we're sharing, it's near and dear to your family as well, of the challenges there. And we're definitely getting a current generation of mid-range nurses, or more importantly, nighttime nurses, because we always need to staff after hours, that are looking to get out of the nursing career and get into cyber because they do
a lot of burnout from the pandemic. A lot of people like, okay, that's that. Time to move on. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It doesn't surprise me knowing just from my own.
Yeah, I mean they're technical. They're highly skilled. They're hyper focused. So it's all the things you're looking for in a penetration tester, a compliance auditor, a security researcher, especially from offense to compliance to even on the malware research. Just a research analyst for a malware shop. They make some of the best candidates I've found so far.
Well, why do you think we haven't had more success in recruiting into this career, especially given that the jobs pay well? They're white collar jobs, professional jobs. My sense is that we have not had the support of like the federal government that we need to really kind of push this nationally and really provide the resources to start channeling kind of the Rosie the Riveter approach,
Yeah.
channeling people into this thing that we need,
Yeah, I could definitely agree with that. I think the other challenge and the one I face, especially with high school students, we haven't advertised the fact that cybersecurity is a term. It is a job, it
Yeah.
is a skill set. Within cybersecurity, there's, 20 plus different career paths today that if you, kind of specialize and focus, offense, we have, literally enterprise app and security research. On, defense, we've got security analyst, security engineer for building the infrastructure. We've got incident response capabilities. You've got compliance and all the alphabet soup that comes with that and specialty. And then you've got, vertical specific like OT that, can actually draw more attention to the wider audience. Nowadays kids come up and like, I think cybersecurity, and the first thing they get talked to is about, basically some firewalls, some networking infrastructure, and really that's unfortunately the entry level in the industry. And how do you get into this? Well, go get your CompTIA plus, security plus plus, and then you can start shopping your job for the first foot in the door. And it's like, but I don't want to do that. I want to do this. So again, we have the challenge of being, we're an industry, we have speciality.
Yeah.
So giving them a proper career path for where they want to land is really the kind of the message I've been going back to.
Instead of trying to push them through the same funnel we've been pushing people through for 20 years. Yeah.
I mean, I can cite my own daughter. She's about to graduate college, but when she graduated high school, she went to a STEM school. There was 151 graduating students, 38 declared cybersecurity, and 2 had a job. Both of them went to work immediately for actually, Frontier Airlines, who had an apprenticeship program on application security. And so they went straight to work. They skipped the school route, and now I know both of them very well. One of them's going back to school to learn essentially basic MBA, so you can actually talk business and become a manager.
Right, that's where you need to move on. Jim Broome, Chief Technology Officer at DirectDefense. Thanks so much for coming on the Security Ledger podcast, and we'll do this again.